Welcome to The Standard. From Vancouver, I'm Peter Klein. Tonight, a man who went from orphanage to entrepreneur. Furniture magnate John Volkin is here talking about giving back to the community by helping addicts clean up and return to the workforce. But first, the story behind Richard Nixon's history-changing trip to China. Richard Nixon's groundbreaking meeting with Chinese leader Mao Zedong has been immortalized in books, lectures, and even music. John Adams' classic opera Nixon in China recently had its Canadian premiere in Vancouver. And to commemorate the launch, the Vancouver Opera invited renowned historian Margaret MacMillan to come from England to discuss her classic book by the same name. I sat down with Dr. MacMillan at the Fairmont Pacific Rim Hotel in downtown Vancouver. You're in Vancouver for the Canadian premiere of the opera Nixon in China, written by John Adams. Same title as one of your most acclaimed books. You studied that week in 1972 when Nixon and Mao met for the first time. Before we get to the book, what's your impression of how China has changed in the 39 years since that meeting? Is it a different country?
I don't think countries are ever completely different. That doesn't happen because you have deeply ingrained cultural habits, ways of looking at the world, ways of organizing societies. And so clearly China is still China in some recognizable way. But in the past 39 years, of course, the change has been huge. I mean, when Mao was in power, and he didn't die till 76, he kept really a lid on change. He never ceased trying to make China into some sort of communist or socialist society. Once he had died, an obstacle to change was really removed, and we saw this incredible economic expansion, but also the growth of big cities, growth of a consumerist society, tremendous changes in technology. And so, yes, it's a very different China than it was when Nixon visited in 1972.
In your book, you referenced the fact that trade was not really discussed. Kissinger even sort of was disparaging about trade. Well, I mean, we don't negligible trade with China, and we probably will always have negligible trade with China. Right. I mean, looking back on that, it's almost comical. It's
one of the times when Henry Kissinger, who is, I think, a very clever man, was completely wrong. And I think it's partly because he and Nixon, neither of them were interested in economics. And so they really didn't think it was important. But of course,
it was political, really, for them.
Yeah,
it was about Vietnam, it was about Taiwan, it was about the Soviet Union.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, their reasons for wanting an opening to China were to position the United States back in the center of world affairs. And they were very conscious that the United States had damaged itself very badly because of the Vietnam War. And so another real consideration for them in opening up to China was to try to get the Chinese on side to help them get out of Vietnam.
Obama visited China recently, and a number of people have commented, both in the visit to Japan, where Obama bowed, sort of ridiculed by some conservatives, and in China, that the U.S. has put itself in a sort of a subservient position, particularly with respect to China. I mean, they own such a large portion of the U.S. debt. That was really the case to some extent when Nixon went, wasn't it? I mean, Kissinger went with Soviet intelligence in hand to hand off to the Chinese. It seems like he was coming with kind of gifts to open up that relationship.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, Kissinger and Nixon both were very determined on trying to get the relationship opened up. And if you look at the transcripts, I mean, Kissinger really lays on the flattery with a very free hand indeed. I think the Chinese partly expected it, and I think the Chinese knew that the Americans were laying it on. But I don't know if the Americans are subservient to China today. I mean, I think the United States has always hated to be in a position where it needs anyone else and has difficulty with that. But in fact, the Chinese need the Americans as much as the Americans need the Chinese. I mean, that relationship of lender and borrower is a very intimate one and gives both a bit of leverage over the other.
Does it concern you that China owns such a huge portion of the U.S. debt?
No, it should concern the Chinese perhaps, but it also makes the Chinese very wary of doing anything that will damage the American economy. Mm-hmm. Because if they damage the American economy, then what they hold is not going to be worth very much.
Right. Well, what did you find out about, I mean, there have been many books and articles and papers written about Nixon's visit to China, but yours has really stood out as one of the great works on this, because you had such detail about that meeting. What did you find out about that meeting that you didn't know before?
Two things, I think. I always assumed that the key meeting between Mao and Nixon, which occurred the first day of Nixon's arrival in Beijing, in fact, didn't do very much. I mean, I always thought they'd be talking about great issues, but when you read the transcripts, it's sort of odd, actually. Mao refuses to talk about anything substantive. He keeps on saying, no, leave that to someone else. So that interested me. I mean, I realized it was the fact of the meeting and not the meeting itself that was really important. The second thing I hadn't realized was just how intelligent Nixon was. I mean, I tended, because I grew up in the 60s, to think he was just awful. And I think in many ways he was as a human being, but he was also a very good statesman.
But also very secretive. I mean, certainly we saw just the Watergate happened less than a year after this meeting, which obviously was cloaked in secrecy, as was this meeting. I mean, it was almost unprecedented how close-lidded they were about this meeting before it happened.
Yeah, the excuse that both Kissinger and Nixon gave, because Kissinger was Nixon's national security advisor and very closely involved with this, was that they had to keep it secret, otherwise the whole thing could have been derailed by opposition within the United States, or the Chinese might have got skittish. But I think the two of them also just loved having a secret. I mean, they loved it. They reveled in it, and they both hated the State Department, which they thought was filled with lily-livered liberals. So I think they took a real malicious glee in keeping the State Department out of it.
Right. You described the handshake, and Mao just kind of grasps on and holds Nixon's hand for an extended period of time. Why was that significant in your mind?
It was very significant because of a handshake that hadn't taken place. And the Chinese, of course, were very sensitive about being treated as a real power. The handshake that hadn't taken place was in 1954 at a Geneva conference that was called to try and end the Korean War and various other things. And John Foster Dulles, the U.S. Secretary of State, arrived. Zhou Enlai, who was then Chinese Prime Minister, came towards him with his hand outstretched, and John Foster Dulles just walked by him, didn't shake his hand. And so one of the key things for the Chinese when Kissinger came to China to arrange the visit, and then when Nixon came, was that there should be a handshake.
Was it choreographed who's going to put their hand up first, or?
I think it was simply made very clear that the Americans were going to come like this. And Nixon, if you look at the footage of him getting off the airplane, he comes down the steps and he puts his hand out to Zhou Enlai, and then he puts his hand out to Mao. So I think the Americans made it very clear they understood the importance of a handshake.
Today, China could, if it wanted to, really fit into the Soviet Union's old shoes and take on the role as the other great superpower to balance out the United States. They don't seem to be wanting to step into that role, are they?
No, I don't think they do, and it's sort of a thankless role. I mean, if you take on the role of being either a hegemonic power, the key power in the world, or one of the two superpowers, it means you spend an awful lot on your military. It means you probably have to prop up other people's currencies. I mean, you have to act as a world's policeman and a world's sort of banker of last resort. And the Chinese have not shown much enthusiasm for taking on that rather thankless and expensive role. They may have to in the end. I mean, if they become powerful enough, and it's a big if, but if they become powerful enough, they're going to have to try and make sure the international system works, because otherwise they're in trouble.
Although, sort of watching this from the outside, and I'm not a political scientist, and I don't cover the United Nations. I used to cover the United Nations, and I was there during some Cambodian atrocities, and it was interesting how China was constantly silent about everything. About Bosnia, I mean, it was like they weren't even there, even though they were obviously had a major seat at the table. But lately I've noticed that the Chinese ambassador to the United Nations, maybe it's just a personality thing, but seems more bold, more willing to express opinions about geopolitical situations around the world. Is that maybe an incorrect analysis, or does it have to do maybe with how the world has changed since 9/11?
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think it's not just 9/11, but I think the Chinese government and the party have become more confident in asserting Chinese interests and China taking a role. You notice it particularly in Asia, where the Chinese are much more assertive, dealing with issues like North Korea, dealing with their neighbors. And so I think we're seeing a China which is moving, perhaps reluctantly, more into an active role in the world. The Chinese have certainly joined a lot of international organizations and have been working through a lot of organizations. It's interesting about Bush because he reads a lot of history. He reads a great deal of history, but he seems to read it, or he certainly seemed to read it when he was in the White House, to prove that he was right. And he went back into history and said, look, it validates me. I'm like Truman, I'm like Churchill, I'm doing the right thing.